I use the same amount of the resources that they do in 40 generations. When I compare with the Maasai in Africa, I use 250 times what they do. So when we start to change the society to something sustainable, we need to think about the equity. And I never hear this word in these discussions. But it's very, very important.
One and a half years ago, Lars Larsen was invited to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to meet with a number of the foremost scientists within the discipline of complex adaptive system science in Santa Fe. They wanted to hear how he described what mankind has created in a very short period of time that is now challenging us as species. Stuart Kauffman, who has actually invented the concept of the adjacent possible, the unknown that can emerge when something is really challenging and human intelligence is let loose to find solutions, more or less in a quantum leap. He told Lars after his seminar, "If you are right in your conclusions, the world is wrong. I need to examine and scrutinize everything you've said." 6 months later, Stuart Kauffman calls Lars and says, "Now I've checked every single figure, fact, and assumption that you have presented. And I'm afraid you are right. The world is wrong. I want a meeting in Stockholm to discuss these questions with the most sophisticated of the scientists around me." Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very proud and grateful to be able to welcome you to this very special day. My name is Annika Dopping, and my passion as a senior TV producer has always been to find and convey human progress in any form to as many as possible. So the moment I heard about this auspicious assembly, for the first time ever, was going to meet in Stockholm to explore whether complex systems adaptive science could help our endangered species survive in these very troubled times and help us change course to a sustainable one. I started my endeavor to see how can we share this with the public.
There's a way in which for many years the sciences of complexity, if there is such a thing, has tried to look at very complicated systems made up of relatively simple parts to understand how the whole system behaves collectively when lots of variables are interacting with lots of variables.
And how is it helpful? Because we tend to end up in silos, being specialized in one arena. And can this really embrace all the complexity that we see right now? Is it possible with algorithms to cover that?
Well, yes and no. And the no is as interesting as the yes. We can now make very, very complicated models, and people do. For example, there are people in this room who study weather, and we've known for many, many years that weather, there's the famous butterfly effect, you know, when
please tell everybody.
It's a very tired butterfly in Rio de Janeiro, and when it flaps its wings, occasionally it changes the weather in Stockholm. Mm-hmm. That's called sensitivity to initial conditions. It's called deterministic chaos. So we've known about it since Poincaré in about 1898. And that's why you can't have very long-term weather prediction, because the system veers off from what you'd have predicted. A very important thing, it's kind of hard to explain, the becoming of the biosphere is not algorithmic. It's beyond any entailing law, and it bears on what we're confronting. Newton told us how to think, have the laws for the system, integrate the equations, and you'll know how the billiard balls rolls. You cannot do Newton for the evolving biosphere. There's no laws at all that describe how the biosphere will develop. Life started 3.7 billion years ago. Nothing could have said giraffes or human beings, or hearing, or flight, or the function of the kidney. And that's part of why I wrote a book called Reinventing the Sacred, some years ago.
The sacred, although you're an atheist.
I'm getting to be agnostic. I think it's age.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the notion that the becoming of a biosphere is beyond entailing laws. Newton's are entailing laws. They logically determine what will happen. It's magical. How much magic do you want? That we started 3.7 billion years ago with little protocells, and then bacteria, and then more complex eukaryotes, and then more complex single-cell organisms, then multi-cell organisms, and the Cambrian explosion, and it creates its own becoming. The biosphere becomes into the possibilities that it itself creates. And so does the economy. The economy becomes, it's the adjacent possible.
What is adjacent possible?
Given what's around now, what can arise next? So once there are cell phones, apps are in the adjacent possible. And we are literally sucked into the adjacent possibles that we ourselves create, but we don't know we're creating them. I mean, nobody 200 years ago knew that we'd have apps, but we do.
This red square is the time we used to create the problems we here today to discuss. And when I went to Santa Fe, I make a list of challenges. And it's not only the climate change, extinction of insects. You can see the long list. So this was the discussion we have in Santa Fe, and we understand that the problem is much bigger than only the climate change. It's not enough to correct the climate. We will not survive if we don't take care of many of this. I have a son named Johan, and I have a grandson, and his name is Ole. I hope there will be generation coming, and I'm sure if we go on with this lifestyle, they will not survive. These people, as I told you, lived a sustainable lifestyle. Because of them, we're here. But now we crash the systems. If we listen to IPCC, we have this time schedule. Here we start to discuss it. And we didn't do nothing. Now we're here and have this time. So if you follow this, the banding of this must be like this. There is another dimension in this also. When I compare to my ancestors, I need to add all what they use in 30 generations back. It's to year 1000. And I use the same amount of the resources that they do in 40 generations. When I compare with the Maasai in Africa, I use 250 times what they do. So when we start to change the society to something sustainable, we need to think about the equity. And I never hear this word in these discussions. But it's very, very important.
Certainly we don't have a chance if we don't all know and all do whatever it means to be creative together. And therefore, the most important thing I can think of is get the word out. Just get it out. Get it on television, get it in newspapers. We all know global warming. It took 20 or 30 years for us to become aware of it, and thanks Sweden and Greta for that. Nobody's paying attention to extinction, and nobody seems to be putting together the fact that it is our global economy growing at 4% a year, expected to be tenfold larger by 2100, that's doing it.
I work in the area of climate and green finance. How do we redirect financial flows so they will have less impact on the climate change and on the environment, but also how do we study the impacts of climate change on the financial system, whether they be national or global, so that we might maintain a stable financial system which does not disrupt the climate as it's doing right now.
In the stock market, we started with a very interesting perspective of if we maximize the shareholders' value, we solve the issues. We give all the power to these guys and they will make the world a better place. And what do we have today? Populism. The destruction more of the nature. We have a lot of philanthropy, but I can tell you it's a fraction. It's a fraction of what the money is out there.
Equity is sometimes interpreted as a value. You know, the U.S. values a tremendous amount about growth, and that happens through competition. And that is a certain way of being, you know, and it has contributed to a lot of economic advances in a lot of ways, you know, things that Stu has talked about in terms of the growth of GDP over time, which really has helped a lot of people in a lot of places in the world. But disparity doesn't have to be necessarily a part of that. So if you get out of the argument about fairness across the board and simply focus on another issue you mentioned earlier, which was trust. Can you really establish trust if you have a tremendous amount of inequity? And I think the further that disparity becomes, the higher it becomes, the harder it is to really continue a level of trust between people. I don't think we can exceed the level of trust and have what people consider to be enough justice and fairness to have a stable society going forward.
All the diversity of humankind brings something special to the whole. We don't want to destroy the diversity. The body is not one single kind of cells, it's many kinds of cells. So we say, how can each society, each community, each human being contribute their own special value and ability to wealth create to the needs of the whole? And the more we become integrated in that kind of global organism, we'll become an ever-evolving, ever-advancing world civilization. And now that we've limited the might say the physical limitations, the economy should be giving us enough wealth to grow at other levels. We know that materially we can't grow forever in a limited system. In terms of our consumption, maybe if we consume less materially and use that time to build social relationships, to contribute to art and culture and science and beauty, all those things can grow forever. And that's the civilization of the future. It's going to be very rich and powerful because it will build on the commitment of every single human being on the planet in an integrated, diverse society.
What we're talking about is a transformation, right? We cannot solve the things Lars' red list here. We cannot solve that in the system where we are operating at the moment. That's not possible. So then we have to think about how do you change systems? How does that work? And one of my favorite thinkers is a systems thinker and farmer called Donella Meadows. She's most famous for being a co-author of the Limits to Growth report. So, you know, when you're talking about the problem of growth, that's like that knowledge is older than I am. We know these things. And they wrote that book and they got ridiculed for it. And now it turns out that, you know, what they said is just playing out in hindsight. But what she's saying about changing systems is very interesting. So if you have the system over there, there's the system, the round thing, and here's your lever. If you're working here, you don't have so much leverage. Here are the constants, the parameters, the numbers, how much carbon dioxide we spew out, how much investment goes into renewables, how much organic food people are eating, how many electric cars are sold, you know, these things that we can measure. Here are the things that we can measure. And Donella Meadows, she said that we tend to spend 99% of our attention goes here. This is what we're thinking about, because this is what we can measure. So this is what's visible. Here's where we are when we think we're changing, but we don't have any leverage. We don't shift systems when we are thinking here. Here's the system goal. So what are we striving for? And what Merle said is we're striving for increase in GDP, right? So that's our overarching goals. We have many goals, but that's like the goal. And here things are here's where the real leverage is. The paradigm used to design the system, the power to shift paradigm to deal with new challenges. In other words, what does the world look like? Who are we? What's important? And this is an explanation to why there was a huge, this is another way of viewing what the indigenous people said, what you said in the beginning, a value shift for survival. This is here. These are the values. What's important?
Here's the thing to bear in mind. What's the recovery time from climate change? It may be in the order of hundreds to thousands of years. But the situation is far worse. We are in the midst of a mass extinction. The United Nations last May reported that by 2050, 30 years from now, 1 million species, 20% of the standing diversity of the planet, will be extinct. 20%, 1 million. Now, bear in mind that before a species goes extinct, its population numbers drop. Well, that's apparently happening all over. I saw a report recently that jaguars in South America and Mesoamerica are dying in their vast range. So populations are falling, insects are falling. So we're on the way to a mass extinction. A mass extinction is 75% more of all species going extinct. There's been 5 in the past 550 million years. The biggest is the Permian. 97% of all species went extinct. How big is this extinction event going to be? Frankly, we haven't the faintest idea. None. And meanwhile, our economy is growing at 4% and will be 10 times larger, invading every habitat on the planet, moving species from one to another environment. And sometimes they fit in, the species fits into the new environment. Sometimes it wreaks havoc on that new environment. The recovery from a mass extinction isn't in the thousands of years, it's in the millions of years, and we're not going to survive it.
This is our paradigm. And it's very old. It's even older than you had in your graph. I think this is Aristotle's model, where you have humans in the top of a hierarchy, or not humans, by the way, men, right? So women are here, closer to the whales. And then we have the animals and the plants and the fungi and everything. This is a fundamental assumption in the Western culture, is that we are, and it's not in the picture, but we are separate from the living world. And we have the power and the right and the duty to control it and to dominate it. But the two legitimizing voices of the Western culture, which is Christianity and science, they both agree strongly that this is the case. And now, so when we are seeing what we are seeing, the hockey sticks and everything, that's just a consequence of this way of viewing the world. That's inevitable, like Merle said. So that's what will happen. You will colonize the world, because there's actually no one out there. There are no other interests, just us, right? And now we know that this world view has to shift. We have to shift it. And we have to shift it into something like this, which is what indigenous peoples know. And we also know that, right? That we are part of a living world. We were just confused, but it was a dangerous confusion, because we built our system, even if we know, people know that this is the case. But our systems, they don't know that. So our systems, our legal systems, our economic systems, our political systems, they are working from this assumption, or from this assumption that we're not even, part of the same picture. So now our task is to realign our systems with what we already know and create a direction, create another story, because it's not just that Darwin-Kopenawa and the indigenous peoples are governed by stories, right? We are all governed by stories, and this is our story, and look what it did.
What is our new relationship with the Earth? And how are we embedded within it instead of mastery over it? And so I find it very exciting to think together through new paradigms, because if we manage this through old paradigms of extraction, maximization of profit, even reversing and say, what does it take to minimize our profit? What does it minimize our footprint and be part of a collective whole? I think that's the message of Santa Fe when we look at living systems, and that the fact that life is a distributed property, not an individual property. Same thing with our relationship to the world. Can we become embedded in the world and have a true, real exchange with the world? Because our life and our economy is in that relationship.
We need to understand the negative compound effects so we can create the warnings. We need to understand what not to do. But we also need to understand the positive compound effects, what to do. But it's
Lars,
not,
could you please explain compound effect, just what that means?
compound effect is if you have two different challenges that add the problems, so you have a cascade effect or exponential growth. There is many of these compound effects, but there are also positive compound effects. I think we can discuss them a little later. But that's not enough. What we need is this is complex, and it's only nerds who understand this. But what we need is a communication group and a communication plan. And just now I see three important waves of communication. The first one is leaders. They need to know what it is about, really know. And when I discuss with political and leaders in the companies, I can hear they don't know what it is about. We need a communication tool that explain for them so they can take the right decision. But then they have a problem, because now they should take this message to the people. And I want to say, maybe this is the most difficult situation that the world leader ever have in history, to explain why this lifestyle have to change. So next step is to have tools that the general public understand. And I think this is the most important of everything. Because if we not have this tool and get the understanding out there, there will be yellow jackets everywhere. But then we can already now understand that we have years after, we need a new information wave. Because I don't think we are smart enough to change a society so all of the people are satisfied. There will be people, groups, geographical, in different levels that have been forgotten, you can say. And we are already here.
In Santa Fe, I've been pursuing ideas around what is life through research in artificial life, which has forced us to look at what is a living system. For the last 20 years, we've been applying that to problems in emergency management and modeling systems, natural systems like fire, floods, social systems like traffic or firms. In Paradise last year, November 8th, we lost 85 citizens. People were waiting for the fire department to tell the police department where the fire was, and for the police department to tell the citizens to evacuate or not. That paradigm needs to shift. The citizens need to be collectively intelligent. The citizens have the information from their cameras, and all we're missing is the algorithms to coordinate. And to do that with privacy, because if you send the information up to a cloud or a centralized server, which ultimately the science of complexity is about, how do you have decentralized collective systems, whether it's collective intelligence or collective action? And so we're very interested in what we're calling real-time Earth, to let people share imagery and data in a collective way, to share information, but not the raw data. And we call that approach surveillance. There's a term at MIT and Steve Mann. Sous in the French sense of S-O-U-S, compared to sur, from under instead of over. And surveillance is the Big Brother, 1984, where the people that are observing are anonymous and your privacy is gone. Surveillance flips that, where I have privacy and whoever observed me is known.
A terribly important component is that we combine the need to change with the possibilities for what could be. And so you had asked about children and education. What will the children of today, my grandchildren, what future will they envision that is not only different, but equally better? Can they see a world where we use less energy, or we use energy differently, or we live differently in a way that they see as being better than what we currently have? Is a more fair world a better world, even if some people have less than what they have now, which is probably a lot more than most of us need anyway.
We have now planted many seeds, many connections were made, many insights, many transformations took place. We are expecting this to be a movement that can serve both leaders, the general public, and us all on a grassroots level. How can we deal with these overwhelming challenges that really threaten us? How can we be constructive together and use our unique human intelligence to create the solutions we all need?
We have to reinvent the sacred, and that has to be part of an emerging global civilization. 30 or 40 civilizations around the globe are weaving together. There's a rebellion against it in fears of being inundated by another culture. For example, that's part of, I think, what's going on in the Muslim world. But meanwhile, if we want to keep the roots of our civilization 5,000 years old, that's fine, but we can mingle our branches. We can have Chinese Cuban cuisine in New York. So who knows what we can create together? There's 7 billion of us. What can we create together? At bottom, our issues are moral and spiritual. What's a good life? How will we live a good human life that's rich and fulfilling when we're overwhelming the biosphere? How will we find our way? And just to note religion. Religion is religio, which is to tie together. We really are one species. We really have to come together on a planet. We may. What we can create together could be huge. So we're faced with enormous problems. It's pious but hopeful. We also have enormous opportunities.
The main thing I got from the whole conference was the richness and the importance of coming together, creating bonds and networks, building relationships, and in the process of doing that, being willing to actually take action steps with the support of each other's different expertise. And many of us will be going to different parts of the world from here, of course, and to take that knowledge back to where we're all from, I think is really valuable. It gives people a sense of not being alone, that we're in this together, that there are people thinking about these key issues of sustainability on multiple levels, some of them very tangible and some of them quite radical and transformative. And I think that the ways that we were able to weave those different levels of expertise and those different perspectives together through the last 2-3 days has been quite remarkable.
What I have experienced in being here is incredibly hopeful, because I've noticed that almost everyone who has spoken from their particular perspective has in some way asked for new values, universal values. In fact, there was a meeting in Seattle a decade or so ago, and they called together, it was called Humanity 3000. They called together all the experts in their field to wrestle with the problem was, what do we need to do right now to even have humanity in the year 3000? And they came up with a list of things, but by far the number one answer was that we need a set of universal values for human beings. And I would extend that to all living systems. Like Pele said, we need not only human rights, we need nature's rights.
We are in a socio-ecological system, a single system. It's not that we have an economic system and a natural system, and the economic system is damaging the climate system or the natural system, which is the way we tend to think about this. When we see it as a single socio-ecological system, we then recognize that not only is humanity one, but we are one with nature as well. And then we recognize that when we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves. That kind of paradigmatic shift is what I believe will change the value system. Now, during the meeting we've had, it came up 1 or 2 times, the importance of the value shift. We talked a lot about what kinds of vision we might have and so on. That value shift is not going to happen, and greed, which is the source of our problems. You will recall Mahatma Gandhi had once said that the world does not have enough for the greed of a single person, but it has enough for the entire world if we were not that greedy. And that greed, however, that kind of what we might call personal, individual achievement, that begins to vanish. Achievement becomes something else. It becomes, how do we become more at ease with ourselves, rather than how do we accumulate more and more.
Given what we already have, we have a United Nations that is very imperfect. It's still nation states struggling with each other for national interest. How do we take that connection to the next level and build an effective system of governance at the global level? At the national level, we think what's perfectly normal. We want to have a legislature that makes laws, that says how we behave and what is good and bad in society. We need an executive to apply the laws. We need a judicial system that can judge when there are disputes and so on and can interpret the law. We don't have that yet at the global level. We have bits and pieces, but it's not working. If we want to solve climate change, for instance, we need to be able to legislate the release of greenhouse gases around the world to equitably share the effort of coming back down to what the planet says must be our limit to avoid catastrophic climate change. But it's not the voluntary agreements from the Paris Agreement, they're not sufficient, because still each one, where can I get the best amount of myself and not the common good of the whole? So we need mechanisms to allow us to connect and integrate globally and to share that responsibility so everybody feels this is just and equitable. I'm doing my part, everybody else is doing their part. I think with that kind of values of unity, we'll be able to find many of the solutions as we go ahead to these threats that we're facing today in the world.
The timing is here, the need is here, the resources are out there. Please come and participate in helping mankind in an explorative adventure we've never encountered before to see what can emerge.